I remember the exact moment the ground vanished beneath me. 1 second, I was standing at the cliff's edge, the wind cool against my face, the valley stretching out below like a painting. The next, a sudden force hit my back. It wasn't an accident, not a stumble. It was deliberate. My own son's hands had shoved me forward. The world spun violently. Sky, rock, sky again. My stomach lurched as if my body no longer belonged to me. The air tore from my lungs in a strangled gasp. My hand clawed at nothing, searching for Robert, for anything to hold. Then I heard the sickening crack of impact as my body slammed against the rocks. Pain shot through me so sharp it seemed to blind me. Every nerve screamed at once. Beside me, Robert landed hard. For a split second, I thought he was gone, until I felt his fingers twitch against mine. His voice was faint, torn by agony, but the words cut through the chaos. He told me not to move, to play dead. Those 2 words became my anchor in that storm of terror. So I lay still. My chest rose shallowly, just enough to keep me alive, but not enough to give us away. Blood trickled down my temple. My vision blurred, but through half-closed eyes, I saw shadows moving above us. I heard the familiar cadence of my son's voice. Calm, practiced, already shaping a story about a tragic accident. His wife's voice trembled with feigned panic, calling out for help. They played their roles so perfectly, it chilled me more than the fall itself. In that moment, the truth carved itself into my bones. My son hadn't come to share a celebration. He had brought us here to die. The betrayal burned hotter than the pain in my broken body. A lifetime of memories rushed through me, the boy I once rocked to sleep, the child whose scraped knees I kissed, the young man I believed I could trust with my heart. All of it twisted into a mask that hid a stranger. As I lay there, pretending to be lifeless, I knew this was not the beginning of the story. It was the breaking point of something that had been unraveling for decades. To understand how we reached that cliff, you would have to go back with me back to the years when our family still seemed whole, before the cracks began to show. When I look back on the years before everything shattered, I see them wrapped in the glow of ordinary happiness. Our home was small, but filled with warmth. Mornings often started with the smell of Robert's coffee drifting through the kitchen, the sound of Michael laughing about something trivial, and Andrew quietly slipping into his chair, his presence almost ghost-like in contrast. Michael was our firstborn, a boy who carried light with him wherever he went. His laugh filled every corner of the house, the kind of sound that turned even gray days into something golden. He was curious, ambitious, always eager to share his plans for the future. He wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges that connected places and people. I used to think that was so fitting for him, because he was already a bridge inside our home, the glue between us all. Andrew, our younger son, was different. He lived more in his own world, reserved and quiet. He didn't laugh as freely, didn't dream out loud like his brother. Still, I told myself every child has their own pace, their own rhythm. As a mother, I believed patience and unconditional love were enough. But sometimes, in the silence of our dinners, I wondered what storms might be hiding behind his stillness. On Sundays, we gathered around the oak table Robert had built with his own hands. Michael would chatter about his studies, his eyes sparkling, while Andrew picked at his food in silence. I often wished he would speak more, share something of his thoughts. I convinced myself it was only his nature. What I didn't see then, or maybe refused to see, was that this silence was not peace. It was distance. Life moved forward, marked by routines that felt safe and predictable. School, work, church, long evening walks with Robert. I thought we were building a future that would carry us gently into old age. But small cracks had already begun forming. Ones I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe in the picture of a perfect family. The illusion broke one October evening. Michael didn't come home. At first, I thought he'd stayed late with friends, but hours passed, and worry clawed its way through me. By dawn, the police told us his body had been found at the bottom of a gorge. They said it was an accident, a stumble in the dark. Their words numbed me. A tragic accident. They called it. I clung to that explanation because the alternative was too unbearable to imagine. But as the years went on, silence settled where Michael's laughter used to live, and Andrew's quiet eyes seemed colder than ever. What I didn't know then was that the truth of Michael's death was far darker than any accident, and one day it would come back to break me all over again. For years after Michael's death, I lived with a silence that never felt natural. People told me grief changes a family, that some wounds never close, and I clung to that explanation. I told myself Andrew's coldness was just his way of coping, that the absence of tears was a shield for pain too deep to show. But the truth is, a part of me always felt unsettled. The way he avoided Michael's name, the way his eyes hardened whenever anyone spoke of his brother. I buried those doubts because I needed to believe my family was still whole. It wasn't until decades later, one quiet night in the kitchen, that the silence finally cracked. Robert and I were washing dishes, a chore we had done together for 40 years. Out of nowhere, his hands froze under the water and his face turned pale. His voice came low, heavy with something I had never heard before, the weight of a secret too long carried. He told me he had followed the boys that night, that Michael had discovered Andrew had been stealing money from our savings, small amounts at first, then more. He confronted him with proof, demanding honesty. Robert said their voices grew louder, anger spilling out into the night. And then, in one blinding instant, Andrew shoved Michael. He watched our firstborn lose his balance, reaching for air, then vanish into the darkness below. As Robert spoke, my knees gave way. I gripped the counter, fighting for breath, as if the world itself had collapsed around me. For 25 years, I had lived beside my son's killer, loving him, protecting him, believing he had simply endured tragedy. And all that time, Robert had carried this secret alone, hoping it was an accident, convincing himself that silence would preserve what little remained of our family. But hearing it aloud shattered me. Michael had been taken from me not by fate, not by cruel chance, but by his own brother's hands. The boy I had once rocked to sleep, the child I had defended in his quietness, had grown into a man capable of fratricide. The grief that once drowned me returned sharper, heavier, twisted now with betrayal, and yet, as unbearable as the truth was, I could not ignore it. Because what I saw next in Andrew's life was even more chilling, the way he hid behind a mask of responsibility, crafting an image of the devoted son. A mask so convincing, even I wanted to believe it. After Michael's death, Andrew seemed to transform. The boy who once lingered in silence now stepped forward as if determined to carry the family's weight. He started helping Robert with repairs around the house, checking in on me with small gestures of care, bringing groceries, asking if I needed medicine, even calling just to see how I was holding up. For a time, I wanted to believe grief had reshaped him into someone steadier, someone who finally understood the value of family. When he introduced Melissa, I welcomed her with cautious hope. She was charming in a polished way, with the kind of smile that seemed rehearsed but convincing. Together, they looked like the picture of a responsible young couple settling down, buying a modest home, talking about children, and for a while, I let myself believe this was the new chapter we all needed. But underneath the surface, shadows lingered. It began subtly, in small conversations that didn't feel like conversations at all, more like rehearsed lines placed carefully into the air. Andrew would mention how families needed to plan for the future, how wills ensured fairness, how property could be protected from outsiders. Melissa would echo him, her voice soft but firm, as if her role was to soothe any resistance I might have felt. At first, I brushed it off as responsible advice. But over time, the pattern became clear. They weren't speaking about some distant future. They were circling around our home, our savings, the life Robert and I had built brick by brick. The requests grew sharper, though never framed as requests. Andrew offered to manage some of our accounts, suggesting it would relieve us of stress. Melissa gently hinted that updating the will would give everyone peace of mind. Their words came wrapped in care, but the weight behind them pressed heavier with each visit. I told myself they were simply trying to help, but unease began to take root. I caught the way Melissa's eyes lingered on the family photographs, as if calculating what they represented. I noticed how Andrew's tone shifted when the topic of inheritance came up. Colder, as though he were negotiating a deal rather than speaking to his mother. The more I tried to dismiss it, the louder that whisper of doubt grew. The same whisper that once told me something was off before Michael's death. Only this time, I couldn't ignore it. It was around then that Andrew suggested a special trip for Robert and me, a way to celebrate our wedding anniversary. He painted it as a gift, a chance to honor decades of love. But deep inside, I felt the chill of recognition. I had seen this mask before. This wasn't generosity. It was a setup. And I had no idea just how deadly it would become. When Andrew first told us about the anniversary trip, I wanted to believe it was genuine. He spoke about how much we had done for him, how we deserved something special. Melissa smiled sweetly, saying she had found the perfect spot for a quiet hike and a picnic. A way to celebrate love and endurance. My heart ached with cautious hope. After everything, maybe this was Andrew trying to give back. The morning of the trip, Andrew arrived with military precision. He packed the car himself snacks, water, blankets, a first aid kit. Too much for a simple afternoon hike. Yet I brushed the thought aside. Melissa fussed over details, her voice smooth, her movements deliberate. She kept glancing at Robert and me as if measuring every reaction. I told myself it was concern, but in hindsight, it was something colder. The drive was long, winding through back roads that seemed more remote with each passing mile. Andrew kept up light conversation, but I noticed how often he checked the rearview mirror, as if watching us rather than the road ahead. By the time we reached the trail, the sun hung low, painting the trees gold. It should have been beautiful, but unease settled into me like a weight I couldn't shake. The hike started pleasantly enough. Birds called overhead, leaves crunched underfoot, and Andrew walked slightly ahead, pointing out views as though he had rehearsed the route. Melissa lingered close, her hand brushing mine at times, her smile too fixed, her eyes too sharp. The higher we climbed, the narrower the path became. Rocks jutted out, the drop growing steeper on one side. My chest tightened. Something about the place felt wrong. Robert squeezed my hand as if to say, "Hold on to hope." And I tried. I told myself Andrew had changed, that this trip was proof of his love, but every instinct screamed otherwise. At the summit, the view was breathtaking, rolling hills fading into the horizon. Andrew insisted we come closer to the edge for a better look. My steps felt heavy, dread pooling in my stomach. Robert moved beside me, his hand brushing my back. Then, in one swift moment, everything I feared became real. The shove came hard and sudden. The world tilted. My feet left the ground. Air ripped past me, and the sky spun into chaos. I heard Robert's gasp, felt his hand slip from mine, and in that instant, betrayal cut deeper than any jagged rock below. Our son had pushed us. The fall was a blur of pain, wind, and terror. It was the very moment I had described before. The ground rushing up to meet us. The cold realization that this was no accident. That was how the trip ended. Not in celebration, not in love, but in a plunge meant to erase us. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the nightmare was only beginning. The real horror lay in what Andrew and Melissa planned to do after. I woke to the rhythmic hum of machines and the sharp scent of antiseptic. The hospital room felt like a suspended world, sealed off from time, yet filled with the weight of danger. My body ached in every bone, but I knew I had to stay still, too still. Robert and I had agreed without words if Andrew and Melissa thought we were weak, maybe even slipping away. They would feel safe. If they suspected we were stronger than we looked, they might finish what they started. I let my eyelids flutter just enough to see the pale walls and the sterile light overhead. The beeping of my monitor was steady, but inside, my pulse raced with the memory of that cliff. I thought about Andrew's hands against my back, the final shove, and I had to will myself not to tremble. There was one moment, though, when I realized we weren't entirely alone. A nurse, kind-eyed and quiet, lingered longer than the others. I could feel her studying me. She adjusted my blanket, smoothed my hair, and then her hand brushed mine. It was subtle, but deliberate, like she knew I was more awake than I pretended to be. In that touch, I felt an ally. Time blurred in that room. Hours felt like days. Melissa came once, her perfume cutting through the antiseptic. Her smile stretched too wide. She leaned over me, and though I kept my face slack, I felt the chill of her breath as if she were checking for signs of life. My heart thudded so hard I feared it would betray me, but I stayed limp. Later, when Robert stirred, he whispered just enough for me to hear, hidden beneath his pillow. His phone had survived the fall, and inside it was something far more valuable than we could have imagined a recording. I hadn't even realized he had pressed record during the hike. On that tiny device, we held their voices, their plotting, their cold words about inheritance and wiping us out of the way. When the nurse discovered the recording, her eyes hardened with quiet determination. She didn't say much, just a nod that told me she understood. She became our lifeline, slipping word to the right people, making sure that the evidence found its way to those who could protect us. The suspense of those days pressed down like a storm waiting to break. I lived in the tension between dread and hope. Every time footsteps echoed in the hall, I wondered if it was Andrew coming back. Every time the door opened, my breath froze in my chest. But then, the shift came. One evening, I sensed a new presence in the room. Not the predatory watch of my son, but the firm, grounded weight of law. Plainclothes officers stood quietly near the door, their eyes sharp, their expressions unreadable. They didn't need words. I knew they had come for Andrew and Melissa. For the first time since the fall, I felt something more than fear. I felt the edges of justice drawing close, wrapping around us like a fragile shield. It wasn't over yet, not until the truth was laid bare in a courtroom, but in that moment, I allowed myself to breathe. And as the officers moved silently down the hall, I knew we were stepping into the next chapter, the one where Andrew would finally face what he had done. Part 8 would not be about survival in silence anymore. It would be about truth spoken aloud, no matter how much it shattered. The courthouse was colder than I imagined, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Every step I took toward that courtroom felt like it carried the weight of a lifetime. My son, my own flesh and blood, sat on the other side of that room, accused of trying to kill us. Beside him, Melissa, with the same sharpness in her eyes I had once mistaken for charm. I could hardly recognize the boy I raised, and yet there he was, head bowed, pretending to be a man misunderstood. When I took my seat, my hands trembled. It wasn't just nerves, it was grief. Grief for the years I had believed in him. Grief for the love I had poured into someone who had twisted it into something unrecognizable. The judge's gavel struck, and suddenly, our private nightmare became public. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline. They spoke of inheritance, of debts, of motives woven in financial desperation. I tried to keep my eyes on the floor, but when they played Robert's phone recording, I had to lift my head. Hearing Andrew's voice filled the room like poison. His words were cold, calculated, spoken with the kind of ease that only comes from long planning. He had spoken of us not as his parents, but as obstacles to be removed. My chest tightened with every syllable. I wanted to scream, to ask him why. But all I could do was sit in silence as the evidence spoke for itself. Then came the nurse's testimony. She described the way she had noticed my hand move, the flicker of my eyelids. She spoke of how she had realized I was alive, aware, but too afraid to show it. She became our guardian angel in that hospital room, and now she was our voice in court. Her calm, unwavering account gave me strength. The defense tried to paint Andrew as a devoted son under pressure. Melissa as a loyal wife caught in the storm. But every shred of evidence stripped away that mask. By the time the verdict approached, even Andrew's composure began to crack. I saw it the flicker in his eyes when he realized the performance was over. When the judge announced the guilty verdict, a strange silence filled me. It wasn't joy, not even relief. It was sorrow, deep and unshakable. My son was guilty of attempting to murder us. Melissa, too. They were sentenced, and as the bailiffs led them away, I couldn't look. I stared instead at the floor, tears burning my eyes. The aftermath was both devastating and strangely tender. The court granted us custody of Andrew and Melissa's children, our grandchildren. Those innocent lives, untouched by the choices their parents had made, became our reason to keep going, holding them in my arms. I felt both the weight of all we had lost and the fragile hope of what we might still build. I wish I could say the story ended neatly, tied with forgiveness and peace, but the truth is messier. We live with scars, with memories that wake us in the night, with questions that will never have answers. And yet, in the laughter of our grandchildren, in the quiet mornings we now share, there is something like healing. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this family can be both the deepest wound and the greatest gift. We cannot choose the blood we share, but we can choose how we protect love, how we nurture it in the next generation. So, if my story reaches you, I ask only this: hold close the ones who truly love you. Notice the small signs, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of truth. If this story moved you, share it, talk about it, leave your thoughts, because sometimes telling the truth is the only way to heal. And perhaps, in sharing, we can help others see the warning signs before it's too late.